afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your patience, and I appreciate that there are so many people signed up for this webinar. I think we have a really good webinar planned for today, so I'm not going to keep you long. I'm just going to say hi, I'm Patricia Zaff. I'm the Director of Education and Training for Concept, and some of you probably know, some of you may not know Concept. Basically, our mission is to provide high-quality professional training in an online format that's accessible to everyone. So I know we have people signed up from all over the world here for this webinar. If you have colleagues who wanted to participate in the webinar but aren't able to because they are living in a different country or something and it's just not convenient, we will also be recording the webinar and we'll send that out to you afterwards. Just a couple of notes. There are a PDF handout that you can download and make notes on as Jerrod is going through. Those will also be sent by email afterwards. So we'll follow up with you by email and we'll send you copies of the handouts as well as a copy of the recording of this webinar. I'm just going to hit the record button. Jerrod Brown is the Treatment Director for Pathways Counseling Center. Pathways provides programs and services benefiting individuals impacted by mental illness and addictions. He's also the founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, the lead developer and program director of an online graduate degree program in forensic mental health from Concordia University, St. Paul, Minnesota, and the editor-in-chief of Forensic Scholars Today. He's currently in the dissertation phase of his doctoral degree program in psychology, and he's going to give you his contact information at the end so you can contact him with any additional questions. While he is presenting, you can go ahead and type questions that you might have in the chat box for him, and he'll take some time at the end of his presentation to address questions and what he doesn't get to. If you have additional questions or questions that weren't answered, you can feel free to email him. He'll give you his contact information. We were trying to get his webcam was working, and then all of a sudden it stopped working, so we won't have the webcam. We were going to turn it off anyway because there's so many people coming onto this webinar just for broadband issues. So if he can, at the end try and get his webcam on, then great, and if not, then you can still interact with him. He'll answer your questions at the end. So we have 90 minutes scheduled for this webinar today, so I am not going to take up that time. I'm going to pass it over to Jerrod and say, Jerrod, thank you very much for being here to present on this topic area for which you are a content expert. And when you are finished presenting and answering questions, you can go ahead and just sign off. And then I will follow up with everyone afterwards by email in terms of getting you CE credits and copies of the handouts and copies of the recording and all of that good stuff. So without further ado, Jerrod, I'm going to turn it over to you and I'm going to get out of here.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Zeb, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate that. First of all, just again, my bio is on the second page here. Feel free at any point, send me an email. I would love to chat with you about this very important topic. Today I really see this topic as more of a really broad overview about a number of different variables I think we should all take into account when we talk about the topic of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders within the context of the criminal justice system. Any one of the variables I talk about today we could spend multiple hours on, so I just want to say that in advance. We're only going to be able to go through some of the basics, and I'll try to steer all of you in the right direction if you're looking for additional resources on this topic. If there's anything that you would like me to maybe enhance on or offer a advanced training in one of these variables, shoot me an email. We are always open for additional ideas on topics, especially related to this very important topic. I'd like to acknowledge a few individuals who have assisted me with looking at my PowerPoint and just offering some critical feedback. And most of these folks have advanced knowledge in FASD, so I'd just like to first acknowledge them again and thank you for all of your feedback and assistance with constructing this PowerPoint. I'm going to assume that all of you have at least a very basic understanding of FASD, but I am going to spend some time on at least laying the foundation about what is FASD and some of the deficits that are most likely more of a culprit and as to why so many folks with this condition end up involved in the criminal justice system. So these are some of the variables we're going to talk about today. We'll spend some time on the basics and kind of weaving that into the criminal justice system, followed by Miranda rights, and kind of walking our way through the trial process and sentencing, and then following it up with brief talk on how and why some of the deficits related to FASD at times can bring some individuals into contact with behaviors of sexual inappropriate nature, and also leading toward an increased risk of possible victimization. And if we do have time, we'll spend a little time on forensic screening considerations. I do have a number of supplemental slides in here that all of you can take with you, and I think it's a good, at least, beginner's guide into the complex nature of forensic screening practices. So to start out with some of the basics about FASD, the only way to have FASD is by prenatal alcohol exposure in utero. So in other words, if a mother consumes alcohol while pregnant, that is the only way a child can develop FASD prior to birth. It is a pervasive problem. This is not something that happens just occasionally, and we'll talk about some of the statistics around that in a few minutes. Also keep in mind, this is a permanent form of irreversible brain damage, just resulting in a host of neurological impairments and social impairments, and the consequences associated with this condition can also affect the individual's brain development, their heart, their bones, their spine, their kidneys, vision and hearing, and vocational functioning, and the list goes on and on and on, and we'll try to cover a lot of those today. What you'll see too from the research and anecdotal accounts and case study accounts, a high percentage of these individuals have also experienced a number of other adverse childhood experiences such as neglect and abuse. This is not just a problem in the United States, this is a worldwide problem. This is outside of the scope of this training, but there are a number of wonderful articles published on prevalence rates and some of the other variables and factors to take into account with FASD in other parts of the world. Again, this is a serious condition with widespread implications. You will see definitely higher rates of FASD among at-risk populations, so juvenile justice system, the corrections system, criminal justice settings. A lot of scholars, a lot of researchers in the world of FASD call it a hidden epidemic. Reason being, a big part of why they say that is one of the many misconceptions about FASD is the fact that most folks with this disorder have absolutely no facial feature abnormalities. You cannot look at someone with FASD in most cases and tell that there's some sort of brain damage going on. Some of the research and a lot of some of the literature you'll find out there if you read more about facial feature abnormalities, approximately around 10% of folks with FASD actually have abnormal facial features, and as that child grows into adulthood, those facial features become even less recognizable, which makes it very difficult for screening purposes. Some other misconceptions of things that I've just heard about that really stick out to me is I've heard a number of professionals indicate who work with adult populations say, I really don't need to know a lot about FASD because I work with adults. It's more of a childhood disorder. And I think there's an argument to be made that when an adult enters adulthood with FASD and is not properly diagnosed, there's not proper structure or supports in place, some of the adverse consequences can actually be exacerbated from childhood, because in childhood there's usually more structure and they're in school and there's more oversight. When you come to adulthood, I have many stories I'll share today about how and why having FASD in adulthood and you're not diagnosed with it and you have no supports or structure, the likelihood of you becoming involved in the criminal justice system is pretty significant. And it's often overlooked by professionals. I think I'd even take this a step further, is it's really not even on the radar of a lot of professionals. I think it's starting to become on the radar more and more with more trainings out there and more journals and just more books written on the topic. But I think we're a long way from really understanding the true nature of this disorder. And it impacts millions of individuals in North America, and again, it has a massive impact on the criminal justice system. And I do want to point out, too, that there have been a number of organizations that have indicated that women who are trying to conceive should have absolutely no alcohol during their entire pregnancy. And just recently, I think later last year, 2015, I believe, in October or November, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a statement stating they stress that no amount of alcohol should be considered safe to drink during any trimester of pregnancy. So just take that into consideration. And again, that's another misconception. I hear a lot from folks that their doctor says it's okay to have a glass of wine or it's okay to have a little alcohol after your first trimester. According to a number of leading organizations, no alcohol is safe whatsoever during any point of pregnancy. We could spend a whole day on this slide, but I just want to point out some very basics. FASD is a spectrum disorder. It's an all-encompassing term that includes fetal alcohol syndrome, partial FAS, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, and alcohol-related birth defects. For purposes of today's training, we're going to focus more on the ARND, the alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. If any of you want to learn more about the diagnostic criteria and the similarities and differences between these disorders, I would recommend Googling the Institute of Medicine, the IOM, or the CDC, or the Washington State Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Diagnostic and Prevention Network's 4-digit diagnostic code. And just recently, a new Canadian guideline for FASD was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. So if you Google any of those, that should give you a little more information about kind of the similarities and differences between these. Something very, very important that I would like all of you to at least have a basic understanding is with the most recent edition of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, there's been 2 inclusions in the book that specifically relate to disorders associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. And I would first direct you to page 86 of the DSM-5. This is on the last page of the chapter titled Neurodevelopmental Disorders. In that chapter, you will see disorders such as intellectual disabilities or autism or ADHD listed. On the back last page of that chapter, there's a designation that mental health professionals can make while diagnosing someone if they suspect that someone's been exposed to alcohol prenatally, and if you have enough evidence to support that, you can make a designation on their assessment using the other specified neurodevelopmental disorder 315.8 and then making the designation neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. Now, if you go to the back of the book of the DSM-5, on pages 798 to 801, this is in the section titled Conditions for Further Study. There's been an inclusion of a new disorder called neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, ND-PAE. And if you Google this term, you'll see there's starting to be some articles written on this and a few publications. The hope of having this in the DSM-5 is at some point this will no longer be a condition for further study, but it will be moved up into the front part of the book where mental health professionals are able to diagnose FAS, an FASD-related disorder. But in the meantime, if you are referring back to page 86, I would recommend at least being aware of the criteria that's used for the ND-PAE on 798 to 801 is more of a framework to kind of look at the different domains and the questions that are being proposed in there. Looking at prevalence rates right now in the United States, FASD is believed to impact around 2 to 5% of the general population. Now, to put this into perspective, census data from 2014 in the United States indicated there are around 318 million people living in America at that time. And if we take that 2% number, that equates to around 6.3 million Americans living with some form of an FASD. If we look on the high end at 5%, we're almost at 16 million Americans living with FASD. Now, there are a number of folks, a number of professionals, a number of scholars that believe this number is actually pretty low and the numbers are a lot higher, but until further data is produced, we'll use this number. To also put that in perspective, I went back, I was curious on census data from 2010. This is the latest data I could find on what's the largest cities in the United States in terms of population. At that point, New York had around 8.1 million, followed by Los Angeles of 3.8 million. Just to put that into perspective, we again have just under 16 million people in the United States living with an FASD if we look at that 5% number. And to also put this into context, depending on what statistics you look at, ADHD impacts somewhere around 5% of children and around 2.5% of adults. Autism, depending on the stats that you look at, impacts anywhere from 1 in 50 to 1 in 68. And schizophrenia impacts about 1% of the population. So FASD is right up there. It is a prevalent disorder, and if anyone working in a helping profession, criminal justice setting, a clinical outpatient setting, says they do not work with people with FASD, I would challenge anyone working in those settings that it's likely you work with folks with FASD on a regular basis. However, they're rarely identified as such, and I'll get into that in just a few minutes. To give you a few more concerning statistics and to put this into perspective, there's around 4 million U.S. pregnancies every year in the United States. Around 50% of these pregnancies are unplanned. And again, this is where it gets difficult. Again, it's recommended women do not consume alcohol while pregnant or trying to get pregnant. But some women don't know they're pregnant for multiple weeks and in some cases multiple months into their pregnancy. So they had no idea that while they were consuming alcohol, they were pregnant, which was possibly causing their unborn child significant damage. If we look at these numbers too, approximately 500,000 pregnancies involve some exposure to alcohol every year, and around 80,000 of those pregnancies involve heavy use, sometimes all the way through pregnancy. Now, if we take all those numbers together, we're looking at around 12.5% of newborns every year in the United States that have been possibly exposed to alcohol in utero. This is a very important takeaway point for all of us, just to keep into perspective that, again, FASD is a permanent form of brain injury and it impacts multiple domains of functioning. The most important types of approaches that seem to work best with people with FASD is being consistent, being concrete, long-term supports. And I'd take that a step further, not just long-term, but in most cases lifelong. And to make sure they're developmentally appropriate, we need to take into account their developmental age, not just their chronological age. And I'll talk about that too in just a minute. Now, the basics, again, about FASD, again, the impairments can range from mild to profound. On the mild end, someone can do quite well, live independently, hold a job. Maybe they have some basic memory issues or they struggle with math in some mild capacity. On the profound end, we have someone that is living in some sort of group home facility with 24-hour care the rest of their life. Now, I've talked to many people about this, and just experience tells us, and a lot of the research tells us, the folks that are in the middle of the spectrum are the ones that often fall through the cracks and end up in the criminal justice system. Again, reason being, people that are kind of more in that middle spectrum, they may look normal, they may talk normal, but they have so many different impairments, the professional is confused by why are these people doing these types of behaviors over and over again. I challenge all of you, if you're working with clients who continue to make the same mistakes, they're in and out of treatment, they're in and out of jail or the prison system, to at least consider the possibility they may have FASD. I'm not saying they do, but if we modify and we look through an FASD lens and we're wrong, I don't think there's any bad outcomes that can happen if we're using approaches that are developmentally appropriate and concrete and structured. That'll work for any client. So just try to keep that into perspective. This is an interesting slide that looks at primary domains impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. This was given to me by permission by Dr. Natalie Brown. I would highly recommend all of you to look at her website, FASD Experts. There's a wealth of information on there. These are not all the consequences associated with FASD, but this puts it into perspective. And when you're working in the criminal justice system, think about the deficits the individual has and how and why that may make things difficult as someone progresses through the arrest stage, through the arraignment, through the trial, through the correctional system, and then out in community supervision or probation parole. Often people with FASD have learning disabilities, math deficits, reading deficits. Adaptive behavior is a huge issue for folks with FASD. That can encompass communication and social skills. How do they function in day-to-day life? How do they manage their personal affairs? One of the most common co-occurring disorders associated with FASD is ADHD. And I'm not saying in all cases, or even in some of the cases, ADHD may be misdiagnosed as FASD because they share a lot of the similar overlap in some of the symptoms. So I would encourage to look at kind of the diagnostic criteria for each and look at the similarities and differences. Also take into mind cognition, language, memory, which could include confabulation, motor skill, movement, coordination. I've had a couple clients I've worked with in the past, and I have a handful of clients now I work with who are confirmed FASD and some that are highly suspected to have FASD. And through my experience working with some of these folks, I'm starting to ask some other questions to them that I'm just seeing certain patterns. And I work with adults typically with serious and persistent mental illness conditions such as bipolar and schizophrenia and major depression. And quite a few of the individuals I work with too also have a substance use issue as well. So take that into consideration when I give some of these stories. But I've had a number of clients that have been suspected or confirmed FASD been hit by a car as they walk across the street. And as I've been digging deeper, it appears that at least in some of these cases, they may have issues with depth perception, or they're looking both ways and they don't realize that the car is 20 feet away. They're thinking it's 2 blocks away, so they get hit by the car, obviously resulting in more injury. A number of clients that I've worked with too have indicated as a child they've had multiple accidents while riding a bike. So I think they're misjudging distance and braking improperly, and they've fallen and hit in their head. In some of these cases has resulted in other traumatic brain injuries on top of the FASD. The sensory integration component too, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and there's a group of us starting to do a little research and writing around the topic of FASD in fire setting. And I was thinking about the role of the first responder when it comes to sensory problems with people with FASD. I had one client a while back tell me she almost drowned as a kid. She got up and down mixed up, so when she was trying to swim out of the water, she was actually swimming down. I have no idea if this is related to the impairments associated with her FASD, but it is something to take into account. And if you're a fire professional or a law enforcement officer or a EMS professional, and if you're going to a scene, a house fire, for example, and I have absolutely no data to support what I'm saying, but this is just kind of a hunch. People with FASD who are under stress, that is not a good combination. They become overloaded, sensory overload, and when maybe a law enforcement officer is giving the command to get out of the house because there's a fire, they may get mixed up that going down outside of the house is the way out. They may actually go up the stairs into the attic thinking that's the way out. So just a few things to keep in mind with safety considerations. Social skill impairments and executive functioning impairments are core deficits too that you'll see with folks with FASD. This is very important for all of us just to remember is people with FASD often have a wonderful ability to disguise the true extent of their disability, at least in the short term. And especially if folks with FASD are within a prison setting or some sort of structured environment, They can often present okay, and they do okay within structured environments. So it's important for us to really look at how did this person function in multiple domains, in school, at work, at home, with friends. And so we have to take that into account. These common problem areas are supported in the literature, but these are the common problem areas that I consistently see come up with the adult clients that I have worked with over the years with FASD. A very high percentage have some form of a disordered attachment pattern going on. Either they've overly attached to strangers, or they do not attach at all. And then there's a variation of in between. And by no means does everyone with FASD have an attachment problem, but what research that is available indicates that a high percentage do have some form of irregular or disordered type of attachment. A lot of times it'll be infrequent or superficial relationships due to lack of social skills. I had a client a while back tell me about his best friend, so I was starting to inquire about this best friend. When was the last time you saw this person? And my former client told me, well, I saw him a year ago. Okay, how often did you see this person? Well, that was the first time I ever met him. So after meeting this person one time a year ago, he thought they were best friends. During that whole year, he would call him repeatedly, never getting a call back. Unfortunately, this client had a long history of harassment and stalking charges, so some of those things can definitely bring folks with FASD and social impairments into the criminal justice system in that capacity as well. You'll see sometimes maladaptive coping skills be present as well. These might be just some basic questions to consider. I'm seeing more and more patterns of this in my adult clients too. Is, have you ever punched an object that does not move? And so often I have heard cases, well, yes, I've punched my locker in school. I've punched a hole in the wall when I get angry. Almost every one of my clients that's been diagnosed with FASD struggles with managing their anger and stress appropriately. Again, that goes down to emotion regulation, impulse control. I'm also seeing some more patterns too in the realm of impulse control with eating. I have a lot of adult clients with FASD who seem to not be able to stop eating in a lot of cases, where then now they're putting on significant amounts of weight. Quite a few now have type 2 diabetes. Again, some of this is just professional experience. Some of this is not necessarily backed up in the scientific literature, but just some things to keep into account. Financial management concerns is another area to really take into account. Money management is difficult. Sometimes this can lead to vulnerability, where they have a really difficult time telling people no who ask them for money. And again, a sizable portion of individuals with FASD have also or will engage in some sort of inappropriate sexual behavior, so it's important for us to come around these folks and model for them and teach them pro-social behaviors and provide the structure they so desperately need. Navigation deficits too, I've seen a lot of patterns with this, where they oftentimes will struggle with getting around on public transportation and get lost. I've had a few clients who've gotten lost and have actually ended up in parts of town where they necessarily did not want to be at night and have been victimized. Organization is a major issue for a lot of my clients with FASD, and some of them live independently, so they really struggle with keeping their apartment organized. So every year, some of them live in public housing types of environments where you have to have an inspection. So the inspector comes in, walks around, looks at all the disorganization, and labels them as a hoarder, when in fact they're not hoarding at all. They just struggle with organization, and they openly admit, I really struggle with where to start and where to end. Those are areas for treatment providers and case managers and social workers to really take into account and really help folks on the spectrum become more organized, and to educate the people around them as well about some of these problem areas. And substance misuse, unfortunately, is a major problem for a number of folks with FASD. And what I'm seeing exclusively with almost every single client I've worked with, they have sleep problems, and that is another area that I think it's important for us to at least take into account when we're working with folks on the spectrum, because if we can treat their sleep, the goal would be, if they're sleeping better, hopefully some of these secondary conditions and comorbid conditions can at least be lessened in some capacity. These are possible red flag indicators just to be aware of. Now, by no means if one of your clients presents with one or all of these red flag indicators means they have FASD, but at least it should alert you to the possibility that it's something you might want to investigate more. Special education involvement, what's their history in school? Were they in special classes? Did they have a number of in-school or out-of-school suspensions? Did they drop out of school? Unfortunately, quite a few individuals on the spectrum have been involved in the child protection system as youth. History of adoption, multiple childhood diagnoses. I used to work at a residential treatment facility for adolescents who came there who were removed from other facilities, and this is kind of the last place for them. And at that time, I didn't know anything about FASD, but so many of them came in with all of these labels, and most of the time it was multiple labels. And if I could go back in time and know more about FASD at that time, looking back on it, it's likely that a good percentage of these kids that I worked with at that time most likely had FASD. And you'll see again rage control problems and social boundaries and suggestibility and so on. Now, we talk about all of these deficits and all of these consequences, but it's important for all of us to be reminded of this. I was reminded of this on my Facebook page a while back that someone posted and gave me permission to reuse this in future trainings, but people with FASD also have a number of positive characteristics that we need to take into account and also focus on and really hone in and look at all the positives that this person has in their life and incorporate that into their treatment and goal plans. And these are just some of them to take into account. Now, it's very difficult in terms of screening someone for FASD because I think a lot of the issue is, again, a lot of misconceptions, but again, the disorder overlaps with so many other conditions. These are just some of the conditions that FASD can either co-occur with or some of the symptom overlap, so it's very hard to pull the two apart and realize, is it ADHD, is it FASD, or is it both? There was a study that just came out, I think, in the last couple weeks. Don't quote me on the number. I think it was around a little over 400 disorders the authors found in this study that co-occur with FASD. And this was a meta-analysis, so they went through a number of other studies and looked at results from a number of other studies that looked at more of the co-occurring conditions. So needless to say, FASD can co-occur with so many other disorders. So take that into account when you are screening folks for the condition. Social skill deficits is a major area to take into account. So many individuals on the spectrum struggle in the area of social skill deficits. So if you are working with people that struggle with social skills, it is very important to really teach folks with FASD kind of pro-social skill development and make it very concrete and structured. But you'll see this a lot with some of your clients if they are on the spectrum, is a lack of stranger fear. I've seen this a lot of cases with some of my clients. They meet someone on the street and they allow the person to move in with them. In a lot of cases, they're the scapegoat for criminal behavior, so they take the blame, they're arrested, they end up going to jail. They are often naive and gullible. Immaturity, too. This is, again, where the chronological and the developmental age needs to be taken into account. So you have someone chronologically age 40, someone with FASD may function at a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old, half their chronological age, so we need to take that into account. Sometimes they lack that self-awareness, too, of kind of what's going on around them. And unfortunately, I told the story a little bit ago about my former client who had the history of harassment and stalking. I suspect in a lot of cases it's not intentional where they're out to stalk someone or scare them, but they're just not picking up on those subtle social cues that the other person may not want to talk to them. Now, I have seen this with a lot of clients that I've worked with, that they struggle in the area of empathy. Now, on the other hand, I've talked to a number of caregivers where they have had children and adults on the spectrum that have absolutely no issues in the area of empathy. But take that into account. Sometimes they might over-attach, sometimes under-attach, and again, everything in between. And you may see this sometimes, excessive demand for attention. That can be extremely problematic if this is within a correctional setting. And in some cases, obviously, this can bring it to a level of being really clinically significant and can have very inappropriate interactions that may sometimes result in criminal justice involvement. Again, just to hammer this home, developmental versus chronological age. Look at the person's social and emotional development compared to their chronological age. If we can put on that lens, I think it's going to go a long way when we're working with these individuals, and to help them stay away from the criminal justice system, and to help them get out of the criminal justice system if they're already in it. Executive functioning is probably the core deficit that we will see with individuals with FASD, but executive functioning relates to areas in problem solving, judgment, poor decision making. They often have a diminished ability to comprehend the cause and effect of their behaviors. And if that is the case, obviously this is one major culprit as to why and how so many folks on the spectrum end up in the criminal justice system. Also, executive functioning really encapsulates processes of attention and flexible thinking and goal setting. And it can also refer to more of a set of higher order processes that oversee thought and action, like under conscious control. And it also helps guide adaptive responses. And what is adaptive responses? This is a really important area for all of us to take into account within criminal justice forensic settings. But adaptive functioning is defined by an individual's ability to care for oneself and meet the demands of social responsibilities. In other words, a person's adaptive functioning is composed of practical, social, and mental capacities to deal with everyday challenges and problems. I would encourage all of you to look at the DSM-5's criteria for intellectual disabilities, and it talks about adaptive functioning in there, but according to DSM-5, adaptive functioning is broken down into 3 domains. You have conceptual, social, and practical. The conceptual domains consist of like memory, and language, and reading, and writing, and math reasoning, and problem solving, and judgment. And if you look at the social component of this, it's more like awareness of others, thoughts, feelings, experiences, how do they demonstrate and show empathy, interpersonal communication, their friendship abilities. And if you look at the practical application or practical area of adaptive functioning, is more related to personal self-care and employment, money management, and self-management of behavior. Needless to say, people with FASD often struggle in a lot of those areas. These are just a few more areas to take into account when we're talking about adaptive functioning, and this came from the DSM-5, but a number of my clients have told me they really struggle with procrastination, and this can have a snowball effect. And how can it have a snowball effect when you procrastinate and lead to possible criminal justice involvement is a lot of times they forget to keep their appointments. And they write down their appointment, but then they forgot they wrote it down, and if you're on probation, that may result in a technical violation. In other cases, maybe they had an appointment with their psychiatrist to get a refill on their medications, they forgot to go, now they have to wait another 2 months to get in, now they're off their meds. Maybe it's county insurance applications to renew their medical insurance, and they forget to do that. All of that can have that snowball effect. You'll see too with communication, they sometimes have a difficult time communicating their needs and wants. And with social participation, they may isolate, and they may isolate from their care team too. My recommendation, if you're working with folks with FASD, and if they have issues in multiple areas of these domains, it might be helpful to at least investigate the possibility of obtaining the assistance of a payee to help the person better manage their money, or maybe like a home health aide or a personal care attendant. In Minnesota, we have a program called ARMS, Adult Rehabilitative Mental Health Services. Maybe the individual needs in-home nursing to help them monitor their medications more effectively, or just basic case management. Now, so many clients I work with have many providers, and that's great. I think it's important to have many providers when we're working with folks folks with FASD. The problem is, if the providers don't understand FASD and they don't adapt and modify their approaches for someone on the spectrum, oftentimes these people can slip through the cracks and lead to other problematic outcomes and behaviors. If any of you are wanting to learn more about adaptive behavior in FASD, I would recommend reading this article. You can go online, I think it's on Google, and just Google it. It's a fantastic article, and it relates specifically to the forensic considerations of adaptive behavior. Language impairments, too, is something I want to point out, especially within the criminal justice world. Take this into account. I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but I put a nice list here together for all of you. Anytime you're communicating with someone with FASD, if it's a probation officer, a competency to stand trial evaluator, a judge, an attorney, a law enforcement professional, take these areas into account if you have someone you suspect has FASD. Now let's jump into the criminal justice and forensic considerations. Now this is just a disclaimer I always like to tell people. FASD is not an excuse for inappropriate or criminal behavior, but it should alert criminal justice professionals to the possibility that they are dealing with someone who may be cognitively impaired and highly vulnerable. If we look through that lens, I think we will have better outcomes for the individual and hopefully help deviate them away from the criminal justice system long term. This was a fantastic quote that came from an article that was published late last year, 2015. It is generally accepted that FASD is likely to affect a sizable minority of individuals involved in the justice system. This is my personal experience and opinion. But from what I have seen, there are very few forensic professionals that truly grasp the magnitude of FASD. I think going to a 1-hour training or a 90-minute training is a fantastic start, but I think going deeper into these topics is very important. And if you modify your approaches at any capacity within the criminal justice system through an FASD lens, I really think it's going to help any client you're working with, regardless if they have FASD or not. The more we can be informed of FASD within the forensic world, I think we're going to be able to help these individuals navigate more successfully through that arrest, interrogation, and trial process and get them the support and services they so desperately need so they don't come back and become kind of that revolving door. There were a few resolutions that were passed by the Canadian Bar Association, one in 2010 and one in 2013. I put the links on here. They're available online, basically calling for increased awareness and accommodations for people with FASD who are involved in the justice system. Similarly, the American Bar Association in 2012 passed a similar resolution advocating for greater awareness of appropriate ways to recognize and assist individuals with FASD among lawyers. If you Google this as well, it should come up, and it's a very good read. This slide indicates some of the forensic findings related to FASD. By no means are these all of them, but if we take all of these stats together, and again, there are definitely limitations with some of these studies, smaller sample sizes and so on, but what we can say right now from available data that approximately between 10 and 23.3% of individuals within jail, prison, confinement settings may have been exposed to alcohol prenatally. Now, however, what research tells us and anecdotal and case study accounts, the overwhelming majority of these individuals were never properly diagnosed, and they usually come in with a number of other labels besides FASD. Now, I think it's important for all of us to become FASD informed. Whoever's working in the criminal justice, mental health, social service, any helping profession, these are just some of the areas to really consider. I don't have stats to say how many people are evaluated every year for a competency to stand trial evaluation who has FASD, but it's likely there are some. And if you're working within any of these types of settings, it would probably be beneficial to you to at least have a basic understanding and consider adopting your approach through an FASD lens. There are a number of challenges and problems associated with FASD within forensic populations as to why it's not properly identified, but very dysmorphology. Some folks with FASD have facial features, others do not. Remember back earlier in the presentation, the majority of folks with FASD have no outward appearance. They all have very different neuropsychological profiles. There are some standardized tests that do not pick up on the deficits that some folks with FASD have. There are a lack of reliable, valid screening tools within forensic settings. There are some, there are not a lot. There's even less for adults. If you're working with adult clients you suspect have FASD, it is very difficult to obtain birth mother records. Birth mother may have not been in the picture the person's entire life. Birth mother may be deceased. So there are difficulties with obtaining accurate information. Is it really prenatal alcohol exposure or something else? Again, lack of awareness among many forensic professionals. The differential diagnosis piece too, the overlap with so many other disorders. FASD co-occurs with so many disorders, the under-identification. Okay, so now you have a client with FASD. What do you do about it? There are few providers in the community, from what I have heard and seen and read and experienced, that actually specialize in the treatment of people with FASD who are involved in the criminal justice system. Of course, there are some. We need to have more. There's even fewer for adults. And there are some treatment interventions that are appropriate for people with FASD, but we need to do more work, more research in that area, especially within correctional and criminal justice settings. And there are trainings related to FASD that are forensically based, criminal justice based, but I think we need to have more. And there are few forensic FASD experts around the country. There are some, but there can definitely be more. Now these are some of the deficits associated with FASD that would likely be a culprit as to why so many of these folks come into contact with the criminal justice system. Oftentimes, the person presents with many of these deficits, not just one. So the more of these deficits they have, and especially in the absence of appropriate guidance, support, if there's no caregivers around and they've been misdiagnosed or undiagnosed, the likelihood of that person coming into contact with the criminal justice system only goes up. A couple other forensic considerations just to take into account is intellectual disability. Now, approximately half of individuals with FASD do not score in the range of a 70 IQ or lower where they may qualify for services for someone with an intellectual disability. About half score in the average and sometimes above average IQ level. Now, if you look at their adaptive functioning capabilities and take that into consideration, and not just look at straight IQ scores, the overwhelming majority of folks, if you look at their adaptive functioning, function as if there's someone with an intellectual disability. So it's important not to just gauge the person's level of functioning on their IQ. We need to also look at their adaptive functioning capabilities. At a client many years ago, I did not know anything about FASD at that time. Looking back on it, I'm almost convinced he had FASD. His mom had substance abuse problems, alcohol dependence. My client dropped out of school, special education involvement, was on felony probation, never had a job, all the classic red flag indicators. He was approached one day when the election was going on, asked if he would vote. He went and voted. You cannot vote if you're a felon. He got brought into court and charged and convicted with another felony. Many stories of individuals with FASD who have to register as a sex offender. When they get out of prison, they don't always have the appropriate supports and services in place, forgetting or not remembering or not knowing that they need to register every time they move can result in another charge. I touched briefly on the terroristic threats component. Stranger danger, this comes up so often. Prostitution, I've had a number of the female clients I've worked with who have engaged in prostitution, unfortunately. Living instability, financial exploitation, homelessness. I've talked a little bit on the loss of disability benefits. And you'll see in a lot of cases too, a client may over-disclose personal information during inappropriate times or inappropriate settings that could result in criminal justice involvement as well. Needless to say, any component of the criminal justice system is likely to be problematic and stressful for someone with FASD. Now, if you're a probation officer or someone working in the court system, keep in mind all of the different forms that you use, the legal jargon. For someone with FASD, they may nod their head and say, yep, yeah, I agree, yes, you bet. They may have no idea what you're talking about, so it's very important to take that into account. For law enforcement officers out there, it's important to consider when you're giving Miranda rights to someone with FASD. Now, these are two stats to take into account. Around 400,000 individuals with developmental disabilities waive their Miranda rights every year, and an estimated almost 700,000 suspects with mental health problems waive their Miranda rights every year. I do not know how many people with FASD waive their Miranda rights every year, but it's likely that at least some of these individuals probably had FASD. So it's important we really take into account when you are giving Miranda rights to an individual with FASD because of the fact that they have deficits in auditory processing. Sometimes they have deficits in really understanding verbal communication, reading, writing abilities. So if you are reading someone their rights, it's important to ask that person to not just say yes or no, do you understand my rights, but to really check for comprehension every step of the way. And you may need to break things down. I have a client that I used to work with who has suspected FASD. Mom consumed alcohol while pregnant. She was adopted and had a number of other issues throughout life. She took anywhere from 7 to 15 seconds to respond to me anytime I asked a question. She could respond, she just needed more time, and she needed sometimes for me to break down what I was asking her. And if we take our time, we break it down, and we use developmentally appropriate vocabulary and take into account not their chronological age, but their developmental age, I think that will go a long way as well when we're talking about Miranda rights. When we talk about false confessions, that's really any detailed admission to a criminal act that the confessor did not commit. When we talk about false confessions within the realm of FASD, we have to at least have a basic understanding of confabulation, suggestibility, and we also need to take into account the legal terminology or any type of terminology that is used within the criminal justice system, because oftentimes the individual with FASD will have no idea what you're talking about. Sometimes you'll see this where they may agree to something or over-confess right away to avoid embarrassment because they have no idea what you're talking about. And other times it may be an act to attempt to please the interviewer or interrogator or an attorney, or they're just on sensory overload and they just want to get things done, and they're going to admit anything you ask, thinking whatever they say, the sooner it can be done, the sooner they can go home. Suggestibility is a very, very important topic, and it's a topic that I've been really starting to research more and do a lot of writing around. And if you're looking to learn more about suggestibility, I would highly recommend reading anything written by Johnson. And this is a quote from Johnson and Clark from 1986. The extent to which within a closed social interaction people come to accept messages communicated during formal questioning, as the result of which their subsequent behavioral response is affected. Now, individuals with FASD are often predisposed to be suggestible due to the very nature of having FASD because of all the various deficits. So it's important to be aware if you're asking leading questions or yes or no questions that can often mask what they really comprehend and lead to false confessions and ultimately a wrongful conviction in some cases. Also, when we're talking about suggestibility, we have to at least know the basics of interrogative suggestibility. And again, looking at how you ask the questions. Are they misleading? And really take into account, how do they recall memory? Again, maybe they need more time. Maybe they need 10 seconds, 20 seconds between each question to really recall that memory. How is their confidence in memory? Do they have a history of blame taking? Do they take the blame for everything when they never did it? Do they over-endorse certain things? Are their responses somewhat distorted that they don't add up? Fact check, always. And again, are they admitting to greater involvement? And is it a desire to please others? And one clinical consideration to take into account, another case example, I think it was maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't know a lot about FASD at this time. I had a client come in, looking back on it again, classic red flags of FASD. I had him fill out a symptom checklist of yes or no, of maybe like, are you experiencing these symptoms? It was a checklist of maybe 50 different symptoms. Are you having sleep problems? Do you feel depressed? Things like that. He checked all 50 saying, yes, I've never seen anything like that. So I became very curious, what's going on here? So the next time I met with him, I had him fill out that same sheet. At that time, he checked 1. Huge discrepancies between the two. Don't know if it was him being highly suggestible, but it's definitely a red flag indicator to dig deeper to see what's going on there. Again, to continue on suggestibility, are we using advanced vocabulary? Even looking at non-advanced vocabulary, using the word questioning, this brings up a very good point of a former client too, where I would ask questions to them thinking it was, I was on their developmental level in terms of vocabulary, and the person was agreeing with me, but I could tell by body language they had no idea what I was talking about. So then I started asking, do you know what this word means? No, not at all. Why didn't you let me know? I would be more than happy to kind of reword it or ask it a different way. Well, I didn't want to feel stupid. Do you do that a lot? Yeah, usually when I don't understand something, I just agree to it to get it over with. So those are very important considerations to take into account and can have huge ramifications when we're looking through a forensic lens. And again, being aware of misleading questions. Now I go back to the IQ versus adaptive functioning. Consider those two when we're talking about suggestibility. Having a higher IQ for someone with FASD does not necessarily mean they're not as highly suggestible as someone with a very, very low IQ. How do they react under anxiety and stress? Being in an interrogative setting or within a prison setting, or even if they're doing a competency to stand trial evaluation that might last multiple hours, or some sort of neuropsychological testing, that can be stressful for anyone, but someone that has an FASD brain, they may be able to function appropriately for 10 minutes or a half hour. You may need to take more breaks, break it down, slow it down. How's their self-esteem? Do they trust their memory? Do they have an impaired narrative ability and considering free recall, open-ended prompts? If you're looking for an additional resource on suggestibility, this is a fantastic book. I do not know the authors. I purchased a book a while back, read it, it's fantastic. The only problem with this book is no mention of FASD anywhere in there. They do mention autism and intellectual disabilities, but there are definitely good takeaway points that we can use when working with people with FASD. If you're looking for a little more information specific to suggestibility and FASD, this is a fantastic article published by Natalie Brown and colleagues in 2011, and if you Google the title, I believe it's online for free. If you want to go even deeper into this, there was a book chapter published last year by Greenspan and Driscoll, and this is a fantastic book chapter. You can Google it. I think the chapter is available for purchase online, but these are some very good resources if you do want to go deeper into the topic of suggestibility. Now, confabulation. If you study suggestibility, I believe you have to study confabulation. So confabulation is the communication of falsely constructed answers and information by an individual recounting something he or she genuinely believes to be true. In other words, it's the act of honestly lying. It's providing information based on inaccurate memories, whether those memories were provoked, such as in an interrogation setting, or by questions that arose spontaneously. Needless to say, if someone has a history of confabulation involved in the criminal justice system, it can lead to dire consequences. These are some of the overlapping terminology you will find in the literature related to confabulation. I gave you a number of good search terms if you want to go deeper into this topic. These are not all of them. These are just a small snapshot, but this will give you a good starting point into the complex area of confabulation. So when we look at FASD and confabulation, consider this. Confusion of events may cause confabulation when earlier memories are judged as currently relevant. And some individuals with FASD suffer from a disturbed sense of chronology. So when involved in the criminal justice system as a defendant or a witness, this can have significant dire outcomes, and some of these problematic outcomes may result, it's possible, in a false or inaccurate witness accounts, wrongful prosecution, false confession, incomplete alibis, wrongful incarceration, ongoing involvement in the criminal justice system, and it may even interfere with this individual's ability to assist counsel, and it may possibly contribute to the individual not being able to be competent to stand trial. If any of you would like a little more information on confabulation, I've published a handful of articles on the topic. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to email that over to you. Trial abilities, again, hammer this home. Developmental age versus chronological age. A couple other takeaway points. When we're working with folks with suspected or confirmed FASD, try to avoid the use of metaphors. Try to avoid the use of leading questions, and abstract concepts can sometimes be problematic. Now, it's important, again, a good reminder for all of us is legal terminology. As professionals, we must ensure that we are properly explaining complex legal terminology, regulations, and requirements to those with FASD suspected or confirmed in developmentally appropriate language. This is a list of some of the terms that you'll see in the criminal justice and legal arena. These are just a few. I was watching a video many months ago on YouTube on FASD and the criminal justice system, and the presenter told a story about a client that a lawyer had. He called this client and told the client, the judge found you unfit to stand trial. The client became angry and aggressive and began to throw things. When the client calmed down, the attorney asked the client what happened, and the client said that I can't believe the judge wants me to lose weight. So a good reminder when we're talking about these different concepts to a client with suspected or confirmed FASD, they may have no idea what unfit to stand trial means, or diminished capacity, or culpability. So we really need to check for comprehension and understanding every step of the way. This is a slide on trial preparation modifications. It came from a fantastic article published by McLaughlin and colleagues in 2014. In their study, these are some of the recommendations that they want professionals at least take into account who are working in the courtroom. Extra time to explain key specific concepts in court procedures, use of simple concrete language when communicating. Important to repeat information over and over again, and not just in the same session, but ongoing, session to session. You may have to repeat things and practice and model and coach that. Ensure attention is captured prior to communicating. Communicate for short periods of time. 30 minutes is maximum. I have a few clients, they need to take a stretch break every 10 minutes. You can tell they're starting to shut down. We have to be more patient and slow the pace down in a lot of cases. And again, that processing speed may be different. And again, frequently check for comprehension, and sometimes present the information in multiple ways. Find out how that person best learns. Here is a citation for that article. I believe this one is on Google Scholar. It's a fantastic article. I'd recommend reading it. Legal cases, we could spend all day on the legal cases, but I want you to at least be aware of 3 cases. Now, these cases are not necessarily FASD cases, but they have huge relevance to the FASD world. The trial court in this case distinguished between incompetency due to mental illness and incompetency due to intellectual disability. At that time, it was titled mental retardation, with the former presenting the capability for restoration and the latter being a static condition which is not likely to permit restoration to competency. The court indicated that because of this difference, separate assessment protocols should be used when diagnosing these 2 different forms of competency. No mention of FASD in here, but if you are a competency evaluator, I would strongly at least consider how an FASD protocol may be different than assessing someone with a mental illness, and how it may be different than someone with an intellectual disability, and take all those into consideration. As of right now, there's very few articles and guides and publications on FASD and competency to stand trial, but in my doctoral work, that is the focus of my research, is really looking at the competency to stand trial abilities of adults with FASD, using the ND-PAE criteria as kind of a lens and a guide. So as more of my research gets completed, hopefully I'll be able to start sharing that with all of you at some point. Another takeaway point from this study is the fact the judge indicated if you're unable to achieve trial competency because of the permanent nature of the disability, obviously he was found incompetent because there was no way for him to regain competence. And another term just to be aware of is rote learning, and a lot of people with FASD have that ability to rote learn. It's basically being able to recite something, but they have no idea what they are citing. It's basically you need to put it into a factual understanding. And again, that goes back to checking for comprehension every step of the way. Another very important case is Atkins v. Virginia, 2002. This was a Supreme Court decision. The defendant was Daryl Atkins. The ruling was a 6-3 ruling in favor of Mr. Atkins by the Supreme Court. And the Atkins case is relevant to FASD in that the court, in discussing mental retardation, intellectual disability, identifies the same neurocognitive, executive, and adaptive behavioral deficits as those identified with individuals with FASD. The court also found that executing someone with an intellectual disability violates the 8th Amendment. One of the problems with this ruling on some level resulted in states can define who would be considered intellectually disabled. So one state may find the defendant intellectually disabled based on a strict IQ cutoff score, traditionally of 70 or below, and the next state, if the defendant would score a 71, he may not be considered intellectually disabled. And I'll go into greater detail about that in the next slide. Just to give you a brief background on Mr. Atkins' history, he had a drug and alcohol history. He was a high school dropout. At the time of him dropping out of school, he had just over a 1.2 GPA. He was never employed. He had histories of learning disabilities. At that time, he did have an IQ of 59. He failed his driver's exam twice. He had to repeat the second grade twice, among other things, to kind of just give you a back history of this defendant. Most recently, the Hall v. Florida case, 2014. Again, this case identifies the same neurocognitive, executive functioning, and adaptive behavioral deficits as does Atkins. In this case, Hall adopts the DSM-5's definition of intellectual disability, holding that full-scale IQ is no more important than the consideration of the neurocognitive, executive, and adaptive behavioral deficits when evaluating whether a person is intellectually disabled. So in other words, using the DSM-5 criteria and looking at intellectual disabilities and adaptive functioning, the DSM-5 now puts full-scale IQ on equal footing with adaptive behavioral deficits. The court indicated intellectual disability is a condition, not a number, citing the importance of considering deficits in addition to intelligence test results. This was a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court in favor of the petitioner, and the courts also adopted the 5-point standard error of measurement when conducting IQ testing. So it's not just a 70 straight IQ cutoff score now. There's a little more leeway in there, between 70 and 75%. And then also taking into account the adaptive functioning capabilities of the individual is equally important as well. Case law, there's becoming more and more case law in FASD, but prior to 1980, there was not a lot. After 1996, there seems to be more of an increase. If you are looking for some resources on case law, I would recommend taking a look at these 2 sites. And if you go to Google Scholar, you should be able to find some cases there as well. So we talk about competency to stand trial. Dr. Zepp is one of the leading experts in the world on this, so I would defer to her about specifics with competency to stand trial, but just the very nature of having FASD should at least call into question their abilities to be competent to stand trial. Competency to stand trial is kind of that overarching umbrella term for a lot of these other competency domains, but if you have FASD, any one of these domains may be an issue for someone on the spectrum. Just to give you a basic understanding of what is competency to stand trial in the United States, competency to stand trial refers to an assessment of whether or not a defendant has the wherewithal to comprehend and participate in legal proceedings. The defendant must be able to participate in his or her own defense, and the defendant's competency to stand trial evaluation hinges upon the defendant's legal comprehension, cognitive reasoning, and his or her ability to make decisions and communicate with attorneys. Again, having FASD calls into question all of those abilities. There's approximately 50 to 60,000 competency evaluations every year in the United States. There's no data that I am aware of that indicates how many of these individuals had FASD, but again, it's likely that at least some of that number they do. The vast majority of competency assessments are requested by defense attorneys, followed by the court, and then followed by prosecuting attorneys. And a competency to stand trial is a legal rather than clinical decision because the formal decision is made by the judge. In most cases, from what is in the research, they side with this mental health expert's recommendation. Not all cases, but most. These are some of the areas to take into account when an evaluator is looking at competency abilities. All of these areas are areas to take into account that may be extremely difficult for someone with FASD. Comprehension is the basic foundational aspect of competency to stand trial. People with FASD often struggle in this area. This is one of the closest articles I could find on competency to stand trial that at least sheds a little light on the indirect relationship to FASD within the world of competency to stand trial, but competency to stand trial evaluators should be sensitive to the presence of traumatic brain injuries, substance use related cognitive functioning issues, and developmental and behavioral issues in forensic samples because of the high prevalence rates of these issues in this setting. I'd take it a step further. I would love to see FASD specifically be listed in here as well to really consider how that impacts an evaluation process for competency. Cognition, executive functioning, intelligence, memory, attention has been firmly established in the literature as central to competency to stand trial. Central to FASD are deficits in executive functioning, intelligence, memory, and attention. Language abilities, again, talked about this earlier in the presentation. People with FASD often struggle in these domains. Language skills, including both expressive and receptive aspects, are integral in establishing effective communication with one's legal counsel. Again, attention and memory, very important when you are going through the trial process. People with FASD often struggle with attention and memory. This is a very important takeaway point for all of us to at least remember. Criminal justice professionals should be careful to not confuse talkativeness with comprehension or competency. Oftentimes, people with FASD have a wonderful ability to talk and say a lot of information that when you get down to it, there's not a lot of meat to the conversation. So again, that's where we check for comprehension. And again, the ability to understand, make decisions, have knowledge, think rationally, be aware of available options, and express choices are very important when considering competency to stand trial. People with FASD oftentimes have issues in all of those areas. This is a fantastic book. I would recommend all of you purchasing Evaluation of Competence to Stand Trial. I own the book. It has fantastic information in there if you're looking to get a deeper understanding of the complex world of competency to stand trial. I'd recommend purchasing it. Criminal responsibility. When we talk FASD and criminal responsibility, obviously the problem is those affected with FASD are often not rational, autonomous, choosing agents, able to reason right from wrong, or able to choose right from wrong. So when we take that into consideration, it's important to consider defendants for whom mental disease or defect has resulted in an inability to form the intention to commit a crime, or has resulted in an inability to know right from wrong, may be considered not criminally responsible for their actions and thus found not guilty of a crime for which they were charged. Now keep in mind, this can differ between jurisdictions, but again, having FASD at least calls a lot of this into question as well. When we talk about diminished capacity, basically diminished capacity renders a defendant incapable of forming the specific intent to commit the element of the crime. Diminished capacity reduces the accused's liability or culpability. So for example, if you have a defendant with FASD charged with murder, if diminished capacity is factored in there and it was determined that their FASD really diminished their abilities to understand and reason right from wrong, they might have been convicted of manslaughter instead of murder. And this is an important reminder, again, for all of us to take into account anywhere in the criminal justice system, mental health world, social service. Many of the U.S. criminal justice system's belief about behavior are challenged by individuals with FASD who have deficits in decision making, long-term planning, as well as poor understanding of cause and effect and consequences. Again, it impacts every domain, every avenue throughout the various stages of the criminal justice system for folks with FASD. When we talk about sentencing, and we have a little more time, so I'm going to speed it up. This is from Judge Tony Wortnick, fantastic individual, knows everything you'd ever want to know about FASD. This is from an article he published in 2007 about some of the principles of sentencing for folks with FASD. I'm not going to go through these for sake of time. They're listed out here chronologically. But those of you that are making sentencing decisions, recommendations, pre-sentence investigations, if we have any judges in the crowd, these might be some things to take into account. There are a variety of principles Judge Wortnick indicated here. And when we talk about sentencing, FASD, it's important too to point this out. You'll see this in the case law, that FASD can be used to mitigate the severity of a sentence in light of criminal responsibility considerations. Or on the flip side, it has been used to increase the severity of sentence due to concerns of future dangerousness. And this is where I think it's important for anyone working in the courtroom, regardless if it's a defense attorney, judge, or prosecutor, to have an understanding of FASD, because I do believe that people with FASD who are involved in the criminal justice system can be successful if the professionals around them, their care support team, understands, adapts their approaches through an FASD lens, and gives them the support, the structure these people need, usually for the rest of their life. This is the title of Judge Wortnick's 10 Principles for Sentencing for people with FASD. If you Google this, the full article will show up as well. It's a good article. I recommend reading it. When we talk about FASD and sexually inappropriate behaviors, again, all the deficits that we spoke about earlier as to how and why individuals become involved in the criminal justice system are variables we need to take into account as to why some individuals on the spectrum do engage in inappropriate sexual behavior. I've listed a number of different slides here that provide a number of different considerations to take into account. But I think I'll leave it with this slide, and then I'll briefly skim through a few more, and then I'll take some questions. But many individuals with FASD lack the capacity to make age-appropriate decisions pertaining to their sexual behavior, and consequently behave socially and emotionally younger than the chronological age. Now, if we have someone with FASD who is 25 years old, has a girlfriend who's 14, they function at a level of a 14-year-old. This gets very complicated, and there's a lot of ethical and legal dilemmas that come up during these situations. But I've had a few clients in this very situation, and it's a very complex topic. And I have a number of other resources on these topics. Feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to share them with you. And again, some of the reminders we need to take into account when we look at FASD and sexually inappropriate behaviors is that there are few sex offender treatment programs around the country that specifically adapt and modify their approaches through an FASD lens. Now, I'm not saying there's none. There are some, but there needs to be more. When we're treating people with FASD, we have to always incorporate social skills training in there. And traditional sex offender treatment programs often miss or do not address the unique challenges many people on the spectrum actually present with. And if we look at environmental issues and early traumatic life events and inappropriate role modeling, this may be the only form of coping skill they've learned. So we're going to have to reteach these individuals what's pro-social behavior and really model that and coach them on what is appropriate boundaries in relationships and what is not. Dr. Zepp, I think I'll take questions because we're almost out of time, but I have a number of other slides on here that are just some good supplemental slides for all of you to have, and at any point you have questions, please email me. I apologize we didn't get through more, but here's a couple other resources just to take into account if you want to know more about FASD within the context of sexually inappropriate behaviors. And Dr. Zepp, I am not seeing any of the questions.